In this video, I'm going to show you how you could improve your dry brushing. Hello everyone, and welcome to another brushstroke painting guide. I'm Brushstroke, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the painting technique of dry brushing. So what it is, how it works, what disadvantages it might have, and then some ways to maybe overcome them. And then to finish off, take a look at some suggestions as where you can fit dry brushing into your painting process. So let's dive straight in and answer that first one. What is dry brushing? Well, put simply, it is a technique of painting which uses a brush with a very little amount of paint on it to bring out detail and texture on a surface. But rather than me try and describe it, maybe it's just easier if I just show you. So for this initial example, I'm going to use this wonderful base from Generation Shift. And what I've done is I've primed it in a black primer to start with. And as you can see, there's lots of lovely detail and texture on there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you by using dry brushing how you can bring out all of that lovely detail and highlight all of that texture really simply and really quickly. And to do this, I'm going to use a dry brush. We'll talk a bit more about brushes later, but this particular one is a large dry brush from Artist Opus. And then for paint, because I want to really exaggerate the contrast between the primer and the colour going on, to really show what's happening, I'm going to use a pale grey, and for this I'm going to use some Administratum grey from Games Workshop. And all I'm going to do, having given this paint a good shake, is just take the paint directly from the pot, load a little bit up into my bristles here, just making sure that I've got a decent amount to work with. Something like that should be fine. And now I'm just going to grab some paper towel, just going to fold that up and put that down there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my loaded brush and I'm going to rub that back and forth on the paper towel, which is going to remove the majority of the paint out of the bristles and leave me with just a small amount. Now this might sound quite wasteful, but trust me, this is how the process works. So all I'm looking to do is remove most of the paint so it's the smallest amount left in the bristles. So I'm just going to test that on the back of my hand, because as I rub it on the hand, what I'm looking to get is just the smallest amount coming out. So it's just a very light dusting. I think I need to take a little bit more off, so I'm just going to very quickly just brush that against the paper towel a little bit more, just take a little bit more paint out of it and then just test that again. So as I'm rubbing that now, I think that looks about right. As you can see, there's very little coming off now as I'm rubbing it back and forth against my hand, and that's exactly how you want it to be. So to start off with, as with all painting techniques, control comes from stability, and if you've seen my edge highlighting video, you'll know that that's achieved by having your hands in contact with each other as you paint. In this case, I like to just use my little finger and then rest that against my hand or the model that I'm painting, which then leaves me free to be able to flick the dry brush back and forth in this kind of rocking motion. So with my little finger in contact, I'm now just going to very lightly start to brush my brush back and forth across the surface of the base in a rocking or flicking motion. And the key thing here is pressure. So I'm applying very little pressure. In fact, I'm barely touching the surface at all with each pass of my brush. And as that very light contact is made, a very small amount of paint is left on the surface of the base. And as you can see, as I continue to lightly brush my brush over the surface of the base, paint is starting to build up on all of those raised details and edges, but not in the recesses or gaps. Almost like magic, all the details are starting to be painted in and highlighted. There's no camera trickery here, it really is this simple. It's like painting on easy mode. With no real effort on my part, I'm able to apply paint to all of the details on the base and produce a lovely highlighting effect. And because of how simple this technique is, it is often one of the first techniques beginner painters will learn on their painting journey, and rightly so. However, this has meant that dry brushing is often perceived as a beginner's technique and looked down on as not real painting. This of course is complete nonsense, and I want to use this video to show that dry brushing is an incredible technique and one every painter should have in their skill set, because with practice it can produce some amazing results. Easy to learn, difficult to master. So as with everything in painting, practice is key. Okay, so as you can see, this effect is starting to really build up on the base now, and I'm just doing exactly the same process over and over again, just lightly touching the surface with my bristles. As the paint starts to run out in your brush, you might need to start adding a little bit more pressure just to get the same results, but that's fine, you can adapt that and change as you go. I'm going to leave this running in real time just so you can get a feel for how long this process actually took for this particular face. Okay, so what was that? A couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes max. I've gone from a completely black primed base to a lovely light grey highlighted base with all of the edges highlighted and nice soft highlights on all the flat surfaces, all the raised areas nicely painted in, and for little to no effort on my part whatsoever. How cool's that? Right, okay, so that's what dry brushing is, and as you can see, it's really simple to do, but how does it work? So as you just saw from that really quick example, dry brushing is really simple to do, and essentially it just breaks down to needing just 3 key things. Firstly, a lightly loaded, almost completely empty brush of paint, so it almost feels dry to the touch, which I'm presuming is where the name of this technique comes from, because you're basically painting with a dry brush. Secondly, applying the paint using a fast flicking motion of the brush. And lastly, using a very light pressure so that the brush barely touches the surface. To illustrate this, let's imagine this shape is the surface of our base or model, and as you saw, by taking a brush lightly loaded with paint and brushing it gently against the surface with a rocking, flicking motion, it slowly deposits a small amount of paint onto the surface. And it's that combination of lightly loaded brush and low pressure that results in only the topmost parts of the surface being caught by the brush. Unlike conventional painting techniques where the brush is more heavily loaded, resulting in a larger amount of paint to be deposited on each stroke, dry brushing deposits only a small amount of paint for each stroke, meaning it takes multiple passes to build up any coverage. But this is a good thing because it gives you control over the process and allows you to choose how much coverage you want. So if you want a light, subtle effect, then just a few light strokes is needed. If you want a stronger, starker effect, then simply do more passes and build up more paint. You can also vary the results by altering the pressure you use on each stroke. By increasing the pressure, more of the surface will be caught by the bristles on each stroke, resulting in a greater surface area being affected and receiving the paint. I often refer to this difference of pressure in my videos. For example, I might say to apply a light dry brush, meaning that I only want to use a very light pressure because I want to focus on just the topmost details and edges to achieve a highlighting effect. And then at other times I might say apply a heavy dry brush, meaning to use more pressure so that more of the surface area is painted to achieve a layering effect where the recesses and lowest details are unaffected, but the majority of the surface will receive some paint coverage. So as we saw with the previous base example, dry brushing is a great way to pick out and paint the texture of a surface. But did you also notice that I often changed the orientation of the base as I was brushing the surface? That is because it's also important that you work with the texture to get the best result. So what does that mean? So let's suppose that our miniature has a surface which has a series of ridges, like fur perhaps. Dry brushing would be a perfect way to highlight the very tips of those ridges, but in order to do this, it's better to brush across the texture like this, rather than trying to brush along the texture like this. Because brushing this way, you're more likely to find the brush will follow those ridges and run deeper than you want it to, meaning the result will be that you'll end up painting much more of the ridge and actually down into the recess as well. Especially if you're using a flat style brush like the one in this diagram, as the shape tends to want to follow the grooves more while you're brushing along the grooves like this. Which neatly brings us onto the topic of brush types. So for dry brushing, you can pretty much use any brush you like. But do bear in mind, dry brushing is very hard wearing on the brush due to the abrasive action of the technique. So many people like to use old brushes which have long since lost their point and are not great for normal painting anymore. But you can also buy dry brushes specifically for dry brushing, and they come in a range of different sizes and shapes, interestingly enough. And I've got a few of the most common ones here. So for example, there's the flat edged brush like I've been showing you in my diagrams. But you can also get ones that have angles to their bristles as well, like this one in the middle. And then finally on the end, I've got the sort of curved or domed bristle versions, like the one I used to paint in the base at the start of this video. So let's take a look at each of those different shapes and see what difference they make when dry brushing. So let's take our textured shape again and use it to compare how the different shape brushes behave during dry brushing these simple steps. Starting with the flat bristled brush, if I were to flick this brush across the stepped texture using the back and forth motion and a light pressure, its contact with the surface changes at different points of the sweep of the stroke. The steps in the middle of each stroke receive more paint compared to those at the end of the stroke. If we were to do the same with the angled bristled brush, we see that its contact points for each stroke are different, with its shape resulting in more paint being applied to the top of the steps and less to the sides. And finally, if we do the same with the curved or dome bristled brush, we see that the contact with the surface is more consistent across the whole of the stroke, making for a more even distribution of paint across all of the points of contact. Okay, so this illustration is obviously quite simplified, but it is intended to show that the different brush shapes make contact with the surface differently, and that difference makes for a different application of paint from the brush. Now, with this knowledge, it enables you to make a more informed choice as to which brush will suit you better. The angled bristle shape is often great for if you want to have more paint in a certain direction, for example, highlighting from a certain light source. However, it then means that you would need to be very consistent with your brushstroke direction in order to achieve a consistent result. The angled bristle brushes are also very handy if you're having to try and dry brush into a tight gap. By having a point, it means that you can reach into areas where other shapes perhaps couldn't. As for the difference between flat and curved brushes, I would say that they can both achieve the same results, but the curved shape is much more forgiving and predictable as its shape mirrors the motion of the brushstroke, making it have more even contact with the surface. Whereas with the flat brush, you need to be more conscious of both direction and pressure in order to achieve a consistent surface contact with each of your strokes. Overall then, I would say the shape of choice would be the curved bristle brush, especially for beginners as it's a lot more user-friendly, easier to learn with, and you'll get much more consistent results. By the way, if you're interested in the specific Artist Opus brushes that I use, then you can find out all the details about them by clicking the link above. So we've looked at the basic techniques of dry brushing and the brushes to use, but what about the paints? Can any paints be dry brushed with? So the answer is the majority of model acrylic paints can be used for dry brushing. For example, I have a number of paints from the GW Citadel range here, where the base, layer, edge paints are all absolutely fine to dry brush with. Paints which are not suitable, however, are washes, glazes, the new style of contrast and speed paints. The reason being they are simply too liquid to work correctly as a dry brush paint. By the time that you've removed all the moisture enough to be able to make them dry brush, there's not enough pigment and content left to actually work. But what about specific paints that are made for dry brushing, like GW's dry paints? They must be the best paints to use, right? After all, they've been made just for dry brushing. Well, in a word, no. And here's why. The paint itself is essentially a standard acrylic paint with a significant amount of moisture removed from it, so that now it's more of a form of a squishy goo. The idea being that you can simply load your brush from the pot, and because it's so much drier, you have far less to remove on any paper, but it just doesn't work. The paint you end up with in your bristles doesn't brush on smoothly and very rarely produces a nice consistent finish. In my opinion, you're far better off buying a regular paint, which you can use for dry brushing, airbrushing, hand brushing, rather than a dry paint which is only made for one thing and not very good at that. So, which paints to use? It's a no to dry brush paints, no to washes, glazes, contrast, speed paints, and yes to all the bits in the middle. Okay, so we've covered the basics of what dry brushing is, the different brushes, and the right paints to use, but this video is supposed to be about how to dry brush better. And in order to do that, we should really try and identify what the problems with dry brushing are and how we can reduce them. So I would say there are two main problems with the style of dry brushing that we've looked at so far. The first one being, it's really quite a messy technique. The flicking of the brush across the surface texture will often result in areas being painted which you didn't really mean to. Now, of course, you can reduce this by picking an appropriately sized brush, being as controlled and focused as possible by supporting your hands, etc. But personally, I think the best way to deal with this problem is to simply allow for it in your painting process. For example, if you can, try and do your dry brushing before painting any of the other areas on your model. That way it doesn't matter if the paint gets on those areas because you're going to paint them in later anyway. And that even applies for when you're using dry brushing for highlighting. Try and do the dry brushing before you finish other areas to allow for the tidying up of that inevitable overpainting. The second problem with dry brushing is that it can give a very powdery, rough, chalky looking result, not smooth and clean, and it's often this result that lets it down. Now, there are times when that result is actually perfect for what you're after. A great example of this would be ice and frost effects. By dry brushing with a white paint using the paper towel process, you can produce a brilliant frosty, icy effect on ice weapons and cold, frosty surfaces. However, this really is an exception to the rule, and generally, if this chalky, dusty result could be removed, it would vastly improve the result of dry brushing. And you'll be pleased to hear it really isn't that difficult to do. You just need to change a couple of things. The first one being not to use a paper towel or an absorbent surface to load your brush, as it is this in fact which removes too much moisture from the paint. Instead, you want to use something like a texture palette. Now, this can be one that you've bought like this, or you can make your own by gluing bits of old model, sprue, grit, or anything really, to a flat board in order to form a texture, and then prime it with your usual mini primer. This will give you a textured surface on which to load your brush, but crucially won't suck all of the moisture out of the paint as you do it. Speaking of moisture, that's the second thing that we're going to want to change. Because just as with regular painting where you should load your brush when it has damp bristles, dry brushing is the same. And you can easily do this by using a moisture pad. By having moist bristles and not removing all the moisture from the paint on paper towel is the key to better dry brushing. And to prove it, I'm going to base coat, layer and highlight the armor on this Night Mini using only dry brushing. So starting off, I've primed all over with a black primer, and next I'm going to prepare my brush by dampening the bristles using my dampening pad. And all this is a little pot with some sponge in it, which I'm going to add a small amount of water to. I just like to use the handle of my brush, dip it into my water pot, and then add a drop of water onto the sponge, and then simply press my dry brush into the sponge so that it takes up a little bit of water. I'm just going to test it on my hand. This is just to remove any excess water from the bristles, so that I should now have an empty brush but with damp bristles. So for my paints, I'm going to use a dark silver as my base tone, a mid silver for my layer which will make my mid tone, and then a bright silver for my highlight. And I'm just going to add a blob of each of those onto my texture palette so I can use them quickly. And in this example, I'm going to use steel for my base tone, graphite for my mid-tone, and pewter as my highlight, all of which are from Darkstar Miniatures. Now I'm just going to take my damp dry brush and take a little bit of my base colour and work that into the bristles, just as I did with the paper towel, so that there's only a small amount of paint left in those bristles. But crucially, that small amount of paint has retained its moisture. And it's that retained moisture which, as I brush it onto the model, means that it goes on nice and smoothly and I can build up a nice clean, smooth layer rather than it being patchy or chalky or dry or dusty. So for this base coat, I'm actually wanting to pretty much cover the whole of the surface. So it's a very heavy dry brush, if you will. I don't really need to care too much about the direction of the texture, I just need to maintain a light, consistent pressure of the brush against the surface. That way I can build up a nice, clean, solid layer. As you can see, the paint goes on incredibly nicely, and it's just so easy to build up that even coverage. Be careful to not overwork an area though. That means try not to do too many passes over the same area. It's far better to move on and then come back later to build up more if you need to. As you can see, I don't care about getting paint on any of the other details, as I'll be coming back to paint them in once I finish the armor anyway. And as you can see, it's already starting to build up a nice base coat. And because I'm not applying too much pressure, just enough to catch each of the surfaces, it's adding that paint to the surface but not going into all of these recesses and creases, which means I get that extra little bit of shadow as well from the primer with barely any effort from me whatsoever. So I'm just going to finish off this coat and then we'll have a look at adding a next layer. Okay, so that's my base coat done, and as you can see, that's gone on really cleanly and smoothly, and all done with just dry brushing. Okay, so let's dry brush our next layer, and for this all I'm going to do is grab a little bit of my mid-tone silver from the palette. I'm going to work that into the bristles just as I would do normally. It's worth noting that I've not bothered to clean my brush out with the base layer here. I'm just going to mix those colours up because that will give a nice sort of transition anyway. So I'm just going to mix that silver in, and then I'm going to do another dry brush. Now it's worth mentioning, if your brush is a bit dry from the last application, then just give it a dab on the dampening pad just to add that moisture back into your bristles. This particular paint is actually quite runny, so I don't need to do it in this particular occasion. And now I can make a start on dry brushing in my layer. This time though, I am wanting to pay more attention to the direction of each of my brush strokes, and I've reduced the pressure that I'm using in order to leave the dark base coat colour in those recesses and the grooves to form extra shadows. So to do this, I'm going to be using strokes from the top down so that only the topmost surfaces will be caught with my brush and not the underside. This will be creating a sort of zenithal effect. Pressure wise, it's still a heavy dry brush. I am still catching most of the surfaces, but what I've done is I've just changed the direction, so I'm working top down, like I say, to catch those topmost areas and create a zenithal effect. On the more curved areas like this, I'm focusing more in the middle where it's catching most of the light and not brushing round to the sides. This helps exaggerate the shape and introduce more depth and definition to those areas, all the while still keeping my brush strokes from that top down direction. And then it's just a case of repeating this around all the model until those top surfaces are painted in. Not forgetting, if your paintbrush does start to get dry, then just do that quick press onto your dampening pad and you'll find that that adds that little bit more moisture back into your bristles and actually reactivates that paint, making it go on a lot smoother again. Okay, so that's my mid-tone layer done. It's perhaps not so obvious under my super bright studio lights here, but there is now a difference between the top surfaces and their underside, which gives a lovely definition to that armor. Now, I could simply go on at this point and add in my final highlight, but I thought I'd show you a cool step that you can do with metallics, which can help speed up your painting process for other projects. Because I now have a nice metallic silver all over my Mini, I can actually paint in different metallic colours by simply tinting this silver. So, for example, if I wanted to change the armour to have a slight turquoisey kind of tint, I could apply a very light coat of a contrast paint or a wash and introduce a subtle colour tint. So the idea here is that the paint that I'm applying, in this particular case a greeny turquoisey colour, is so translucent that you get to see all of the metallic shading and highlighting underneath, and all I'm doing is applying a very light tint so that it just changes the colour slightly. And I could maybe take that a stage further and introduce a purple tone to the opposite sides to give kind of an iridescent or almost colour shift kind of effect. The sort of thing that you see on different birds' feathers. You could even introduce a brass or gold tone simply by tinting some of the details using a sepia wash. Tinting silver like this can save so much time and really does save you the trouble of having to paint in multiple metallic colours on the model. So do have a play around with it, and I think you'll find it's actually really fun to do. Anyway, so now I can finish highlighting, so I'm just going to add a little bit more moisture back into my brush and then take my final highlight silver colour here, add that into my brush, and then I can start adding that final edge highlight. And for this, I'm using the lightest of pressures just so that each brushstroke catches only the topmost details and edges. Again, I'm working with a top-down direction to try and exaggerate areas which would catch most of the light, but in some places I am going to apply a little bit of artistic license and highlight some areas and edges which I feel would need that to give it extra shine. You'll also notice that I'm applying this silver highlight over all of the different coloured tinted areas I did, and that's because pretty much every metallic colour can always be highlighted with a nice bright silver. And there you go. The armour is now fully painted up from a black primer using only dry brushing and no rough or dusty or chalkiness in sight. Just lovely smooth paint. And the best bit is how fast and easy it was. So now we have this improved way of dry brushing, let's take a quick look at some examples of how it can be incorporated into our painting process to truly make our dry brushing better. Starting off with final edge highlighting. Probably the most common use for dry brushing, this one, and now with our improved technique we can achieve much smoother highlights. A great example of when to use this is for painting bone. I've already painted in the base coat and shaded it with a wash, and now by dry brushing on a pale cream colour I can quickly and easily paint in those highlights. The next example of when you could consider using dry brushing would be to layer a texture before applying a wash. As an example, I have a lovely wood grain texture here, and by dry brushing it with a lighter brown before applying my wash, I can achieve a more varied tone to my finished result, which makes for a more organic and less uniform look, and the wash then has the added advantage of blending that together to make for some lovely smooth transitions. The next example is kind of a combination of the previous two, but it's a process I use a lot, and it's highlight, wash, highlight. And as way of illustration, I'm going to use the fur on this wolf. So I first apply a heavy dry brush highlight to the fur to bring out all of that lovely texture. And then I can apply a wash, which will tone my dry brushing down and help blend it all together. And then I finish it off with a light highlight dry brush of the same colour I dry brushed previously. The advantage of this process is it's a really quick and easy way to paint in complex textures such as fur, and adding that wash over the first coat adds in some extra transitions and blending that you wouldn't get if you just dry brushed a darker colour and then a lighter colour over the top. The next example is a really cool use of dry brushing, and we sort of touched on it earlier in this video, and it's pre-shading, or sometimes called zenithal shading, or more recently slap chop. Either way, the process is very simple. Using a darkly primed mini, you apply a heavy dry brush of a much paler colour all over so that it produces a zenithal effect on the mini. That is brightening and highlighting the areas of the mini where a bright light source, such as the sun, would be illuminating it. As we've already seen in this video, that's exactly what dry brushing is good at, applying paint to raised areas and leaving lower recesses and creases untouched. So by dry brushing this black mini with a pale grey, I'm able to produce a result like this, which has all the details both highlighted and shaded in one step. The downside being currently it's still only monochrome, but as we saw with the night earlier, we can change the colour while still maintaining the shading and highlighting by simply applying translucent colours over the top. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. In this case, I thought I'd use a bright blue for the feathers. Again, I'm using a contrast paint, but this time I'm going to take advantage of its shading properties too and apply it straight from the pot as if it were a wash. As you can see, despite it being a strong colour, it's essentially staining my black and white mini, resulting in it achieving shades of blue instead. One downside, however, to this process is obviously because I'm staining the shading that I've produced already, it does mean I need to be very careful where I apply my colours, because it's really hard to undo if I stain a colour on the wrong area. So I'm just taking my time and I'm going to work my way around painting in all of these blue feathers. Oh, and of course his tail tuft as well. And then I can simply repeat that for the body with a purple contrast paint. Again, I'm applying it neat, straight from the pot, and because it's not opaque, it's not obscuring any of that shading underneath, but instead it's staining the surface purple whilst maintaining that shading and highlighting underneath. And after a couple of coats of the purple, I've ended up with a result like this, all of which was achieved by doing that pre-shading dry brush underneath and then just staining it with whichever colour I wanted, which I think is pretty cool. And my last example of how you can incorporate dry brushing into your painting process is for weathering powders. For those of you who have followed my channel for a while, you'll already know that I like to apply weathering powders by dry brushing, as it's a great way of creating dusty, arid desert effects for bases, and dirt and dust effects, and even frost effects on your minis. If you've never worked with weathering powders before, then be warned they are very messy, so I'd still recommend that you use the paper towel method to add them to your brush. And you'll also need to know that to seal them on so they don't rub off afterwards, you'll need to apply a light coat of matte varnish when you're done. Okay, so I think that's it for this guide. So let's do a quick recap. Firstly, of the tips for better dry brushing. Dampen your bristles of your brush. Use a texture palette, not a paper towel. Test your brush on your palette or hand before starting to brush. Keep your hands in contact to maximize stability and control. Brush against the texture. Always start with a very light pressure and build up, as this will enable you to check how much paint is on your brush and prevent mistakes from happening. Consider the size and shape of your brush for the result that you're wanting. Don't use washes, inks, contrasts, or dry paints. Try and minimize the effect of overpainting by doing your dry brushing before you've finished other areas of your model. And then let's recap the various ways in which you could look to use dry brushing as part of your painting process. They were final highlighting, texture layer, highlight, wash, highlight, pre-shading or slap chop, and weathering powders. Thank you so much for watching and getting this far through the video. I really do hope you found it useful. Also, as always, a massive thank you to the channel members whose names are going across the screen now. If you did enjoy this video and found it useful, then please do hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more of these videos, then please hit the subscribe button and don't forget to click the notification bell to be told whenever I post another video. Speaking of other videos, I'd love it if you stayed on the channel, so why not hang around and watch another video from this fundamentals series, or perhaps my latest painting video where you can see the techniques of this video in action.